Hi guys, I'm back again today with another video, and today we're checking out why American tipping culture is illegal in Germany. Well, that's very interesting that it's illegal. It's not even like something that you can do, but it's something you shouldn't do, right? So let's see why. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe, click the bell button, and let's get it.
To tip or not to tip, that is the question.
Is tipping getting out of control?
With some saying they feel pressured to throw in a tip.
So where do you draw?
I can't even speak. Here you can tip if you want to. It's up to you. It's like personal based thing.
Out of control.
With some saying they feel pressured to throw in a tip.
So where do you draw the line?
At restaurants and bars in the United States today, there is an expectation to tip and to tip well, regardless of the service. And some of our European audience might be surprised to learn that the service industry is exempt from paying members of staff minimum wage in the United States, with the assumption that employees will make or exceed that salary through tips.
I don't pay you to breathe.
You hardly pay us at all.
But in many countries, particularly here in Europe, tipping isn't just considered to be unnecessary, but in some cases, even disrespectful, making it difficult for drink lovers with wanderlust to decipher how to handle gratitudes without offending anyone. But this wasn't always the case. In a strange twist of fate, modern tipping customs in the United States and Europe used to be reversed. So how did tipping culture develop, change, and how much should we actually charge? What did post-Civil War racism have to do with all of it? And what are the economics behind that extra 10 to 20% you leave behind at the table today? Well, let's take a look. I think many modern diners in both the United States and Europe today might be interested to learn that tipping culture used to be reversed, with tipping being completely normal in Europe, but really kind of seen as more of a faux pas in the United States prior to the 20th century. For centuries, tips were left in European taverns to ensure quick and good service. And unsurprisingly, wealthy Americans discovered it for themselves in the 1850s and 60s while traveling in Europe. And some of those American travelers actually brought the practice back to the United States, particularly in the hospitality industry, as a way to feel more aristocratic. But tipping did not take off immediately in the United States. There was actually a high level of resistance to it as it was deemed un-American. After all, eating out was already expensive, and this practice seemed to enforce classist tendencies, where the upper class left a small gratuity for those in the lower classes that worked in the service industry. In fact, there was so much anti-tipping traction that after about the 1860s, that sentiment actually did make its way over to Europe and is one of the big reasons why tipping declined in Europe, and we don't really see as much of it here today. But where the Europeans seem to say, yeah, you're probably right, this is wrong, the United States went in the opposite direction. Because despite this resistance, tipping took root in the American South after the abolition of slavery and the American Civil War. Service and hospitality were often among the first jobs freed enslaved people took, and tipping was seen as a workaround for not paying newly freed people living or equal wages. One of the most notorious examples comes from the Pullman Company, which hired newly freed African American men as porters for their train services. Rather than paying them a real wage, Pullman provided the black porters with just a meager pittance, forcing them to rely on tips from their white clientele for most of their pay. So in the end, tipping further entrenched a unique and often racialized class structure in service jobs, in which workers must please both the customer and their employer to earn anything at all. Restaurateurs soon also learned that they actually could profit from the practice of tipping, and saw it as an opportunity to subsidize a worker's pay with guests' extra money. So even though the racial dynamics in the United States has evolved over time, tipping became more and more prevalent and eventually stuck, even in the northern areas of the United States. And this is staunchly different than what we see in European countries, like right here in Germany today. Here, tips are often colloquially called Trinkgeld, or drink money. It's basically just a way of saying, hey, you did a good job, thanks so much, go out and enjoy a drink on me. But not at all seen as a way to supplement real wages. However, though tipping may be customary in Germany, it's certainly not compulsory, and some Germans may not tip at all. The results of a new survey carried out by Norstat Polling Institute revealed that more than half, 57% to be exact, of Germans don't tip, or at most only 5% of the total amount, even when they've been happy with the service in the bar or restaurant. The survey, which questioned a representative sample of 1,017 German men and women, found that 39% of those questioned only tip between 3 and 5%, instead of the usual 10%, and 18% tip service staff in restaurants between 0 and 3%. But probably the biggest reason why tipping culture remains so prevalent in the United States today can actually be traced back to the 1960s. In fact, this year marks the 85th anniversary of the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA, the legislation that established many of the basic labor protections workers enjoy, such as a 40-hour work week, overtime protection, and a national minimum wage. There have been periodic amendments to the FLSA over the years, but the 1966 amendments were especially significant. In short, they extended protections to hotel, restaurant, and other service workers who had previously been excluded from the FLSA, but also introduced a new sub-minimum wage for workers who customarily and regularly receive tips. This tip credit provision afforded to employers uniquely established a permanent sub-wage for tipped workers under the assumption that these workers' tips, when added to the sub-wage, would ensure that these workers' hourly earnings were at least equal to the regular minimum wage. And this fundamentally changed the practice of tipping. Whereas tips had once been simply a token of gratitude from the served to the server, they became, at least in part, a subsidy from consumers to the employers of tipped workers. In other words, part of the employer wage bill is now paid by customers via tips. Remarkably,
what if I have enough money to get a meal and I'm also struggling, right? Who gives me tip? If I'm not a service crew and I'm struggling as well, who gives me tips? Right? You cannot always have enough yourself. So that kind of culture should stop. It's so dumb. Right? Because sometimes you go to, not necessarily but you might ask, why are you going to a restaurant if you don't have money? That's a good question, actually.
Although the federal minimum wage was actually raised back in 2007, the federal minimum for tipped wages has remained the same at $2.13 since 1991. A 32-year stretch, over which time inflation has lowered the purchasing power of the federal tipped minimum wage to its lowest point ever. So you might be thinking, why don't our legislators just simply raise the federal minimum wage and the federal tipped minimum wage to rise along with inflation? Well, unfortunately, that's easier said than done. Unlike most of Europe, where the minimum wage is adjusted yearly or sometimes every 2 years by a commission of economists, unions, and business representatives who are experts in their field, adjusting the federal minimum wage takes an act of Congress in the United States, making the process inherently political and partisan. Yeah, and that goes just about as well as you would expect.
Who's going to vote to give these good people a fair shot at the American dream, and who's going to vote against them?
The motion is not agreed to.
I've said it before and I'll say it again. Democracy simply doesn't work.
Individual states can make their own laws on minimum wage, but there are still 16 states plus Puerto Rico who use the same minimum wage as the federal minimum wage requirement. And unfortunately, the US now finds itself in a pretty precarious position for small business owners. Rather than seeing incremental small shifts over time in the amount required to pay their staff, just like here in Europe, changes to the minimum wage have been in gigantic shifts. Take a look with me. Starting in 1997, the federal minimum wage sat at just $5.15 an hour for about 10 years. And it was raised in 2007 to what we have now, which is $7.25 by 2009. Cool, but that's a 40% increase in a short period of time after a decade of inflation. And quite frankly, how do you even begin to plan for that as a business owner? And things today have only gotten more precarious. It's now been 14 years since we've seen any kind of increase in the minimum wage. And if we were to move forward with a progressive plan for $15 an hour, it would mean a nearly 107% increase in wages. So, although there is little doubt that the federal minimum doesn't even begin to cover the bare minimum in 2023, as the debate wages on Capitol Hill, it's the workers who suffer in the meantime. You know, beyond the policies that enshrine tipping, I honestly found myself kind of wondering, can you really make a livable wage off of just tips in the United States? Well, the problem is that's really tough to fully understand for an obvious reason. Everyone likes giving and getting tips in cash. Nationally, this adds up to as much as $11 billion in unreported and untaxed income, which, yes, is tax fraud, and the IRS estimates that as much as 40% of tips go unreported. So unsurprisingly, self-reported data, which doesn't come with any tax consequences, might actually paint a better picture of how much waiters and waitresses and bartenders are actually making in tips. A 1996 BLS experiment tried to collect data on this from restaurant workers on an anonymous basis in New Orleans. They actually found a pretty high response rate, around 60%. And their study found that with tips, workers in all sampled occupations and industries came to $6.65 per hour, which was higher than the $4.75 federal minimum wage at the time. But admittedly, this is a very old study, so I did a little bit more digging and found a couple of studies that shed pretty good light on what tipping today actually looks like. Square, a payment service, actually tracked credit card tips and found that Alaska, Arkansas, and North Carolina to be the states with the most generous tippers in 2014. A similar study was conducted by Toast, another digital point-of-sale platform serving restaurants, who reported that in the last quarter of 2022, a tip was included on 48% of credit card or digital payment transactions at fast food restaurants on its platform. However, both Toast and Square's data isn't necessarily representative because it only tracks tips from credit card transactions, which tend to feature bigger tips than compared to when cash changes hands. Employees are technically supposed to report their tips to their employers so that the appropriate payroll and taxes can be taken out of it. But again, that doesn't really happen all that accurately. In fact, compliance has always been low, particularly since so many tips have traditionally been paid in cash. In its tax gap studies, the IRS estimates that it gets about 99% of what it's due on regular wages, where taxes are withheld and reported to both the IRS and the taxpayer on a W-2. But it only gets about 55 to 60% of what it's owed on tips. So ultimately, if the IRS audits a tipped worker and finds that they're underreported, it can demand the employee pay back all sorts of back taxes. But with the IRS auditing fewer than 700,000 of the 150 million individual tax returns filed each year, that's neither practical nor politically popular. So at the end of the day, we actually really don't know exactly how much waiters and waitresses and bartenders are actually making on tips. But that could interestingly be changing as more and more Americans choose to pay by credit card, because then it is, in fact, very trackable because you leave a digital footprint. But nonetheless, a semi-recent Economic Policy Institute and University of California, Berkeley study examining CPS data found that the median hourly earnings for waiters and bartenders are just a meager $10.11 per hour when you include tips. That's just $2.86 above the current federal wage floor, and far below what workers throughout the country need to make ends meet. And that number is in fact lower than the median hourly earnings for waiters and waitresses in Germany, who the Economic Research Institute earns around 27,000 euros a year, or $13 an hour. And in Germany, that tip that you pay to a waiter or waitress is generally speaking going to be tax-free, as long as you give it directly and voluntarily. You know, between the rise in inflation and the recent pandemic, I find it quite interesting that the contemporary discussion around tipping has kind of shifted, not necessarily to discuss how much you should tip, but whether or not tipping has gotten completely out of hand altogether. While the pandemic brought about a new tipping culture to support service workers and businesses early on, there seems to be a more notable shift with the emergence of digital kiosks at checkouts, prompting customers to tip more frequently at establishments where it was once considered taboo. So what was once a question of etiquette is becoming for many Americans a question of affordability. Inflation still lingers, and just last month, nearly 2/3 of Americans reported that they're already living paycheck to paycheck. And don't get me wrong, tipping culture is still very much in place at those traditional establishments, like your sit-down restaurants and your bars. Essentially places where you're receiving a service, where a waiter or waitress will take your order, bring your food, check in on you while you're eating to see if you need refills on anything. In, again, the more traditional setting. But tipping has become more frequent at places where tableside service isn't part of the experience, and where minimum wage is already offered to employees, such as coffee shops, ice cream parlors, and even when driving to the sit-down restaurant yourself and picking up your food to go. And at the end of the day, tipping can be an emotionally charged decision. Attitudes towards tipping in these new settings vary wildly. Some customers will tip no matter what. Others feel guilty if they don't tip or are embarrassed if their tip is stingy. And others eschew tipping for a $5 iced coffee, saying, come on now, the price $5 for a coffee is already high enough.
I'm gonna buy
so, you know, this is the point in the video where I would love to hear from you guys down in the comment section.
I can't afford a $5
if you're an American who's watching this video, how do you feel about tipping? Do you feel that it's gotten out of hand? Do you still tip at places where we used to not be asked to tip, such as coffee shops or donut shops or ice cream parlors, for example?
It's like I cannot even enjoy a Starbucks because I have to like pay for another cup that I'm not even gonna drink. Right? It's like, yes, I really want to help out the servers, but I hope it's not forced upon me. I want to do it when I can afford to and when I want to, because they actually were nice and I have extra and I want to give, right? I don't want to be forced into. So that culture of like tipping is something that I'm not looking forward to be honest.
These are places where the workers are getting the minimum wage. So how do you feel about this new added tip at many of those digital kiosks? But for the Europeans who are watching this video, I would also love to hear your reaction to American tipping culture. Did you know beforehand that tips are actually included in their minimum wage? How do you feel about withholding them from taxes or paying taxes on tips? And if so, does that actually change the amount that you would tip the next time you visit? Please let me know down in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from the Black Forest family, hit that subscribe button. So I'll see you next Sunday. Tschüss!
Tschüss! Wow, that was very insightful. She gave us a description of the two sides. And my stance on it, I really like how tips work here in the Philippines, because it's really up to you and how much you're gonna give. And some places don't even allow tips, like at the mall, like valet, right? It's mostly in restaurants, but it's not allowed to just give it to the waitress because it's more centralized tipping. Like whenever someone gets a tip, it always goes to a jar wherein they share it at the end of the month, right? So it's usually like that. So I really like that culture more. And also, as a person who's going to dine in at a restaurant, it doesn't give you a lot of pressure. You're actually there to have a good time, and you're going to genuinely have service that are genuine, right? So if this person is a mean server, she's disrespectful, he's disrespectful, you will know. But if somebody's really nice as a human being and they take care of you, you will know as well. And then you will also have genuine reaction to tip that person rather than being forced to do so. And I feel like restaurants will make more money that way because you're not pressured to give. So a lot of people will come to restaurants, right? But if you're forced to tip, a lot of people might end up just doing fast food. I don't know if you have to tip in fast food as well. Or a lot of people just settle to eat at home because they have no time to be tipping everyone every time they go to a restaurant, right? Which in return is good for their health anyways. But let me know your thoughts though on this situation. If you like this video, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.